Welcome to the Intellectual Anarchy podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Catherine Cruz, and I'm just a curious cat.
But the idea of functional fixedness is pretty universal, that everybody is at risk of. And when it comes to technology, it's a particularly interesting problem because people think the world is only one way. And for example, we're doing a project now on space armor. And so you think of armor as metal, which you pour or you pound, the way you work metal, right? Everybody knows that. But this metal, this armor, you can only use a 3D printer to make. You can't make it any other way. And on top of that, it's using what's called biomimetics, which is learning from, in this case, seashells and butterflies in the intricate design that's been perfected by nature through Darwinian evolution for, millions of years. And we're trying to then adopt those design ideas into this AI-driven, optimized 3D printed material to be able to take hypersonic impact. So if you just look at the material, you might say, it's so light, how can it be that? But it turns out mathematically it's designed in a very specific way, but the insight to the design came from a seashell, and the flexibility came from a butterfly. And we built that into the system, and it sounds like a ridiculous idea, but that's where biomimetics and learning from nature and what has gone on in evolution for so long to perfect these ideas, we're trying to adopt so that humans can adopt faster. But if you just talk to somebody and say, well, that's a ridiculous idea, you can't stop something at Mach 5 with this silly little thing. Well, all the math shows that we can. That's why we're building it. But we simulated the whole thing. So it's interesting because you start with your bias of what you can't do, and you assume it's only been done one way. You can apply the same thing to cars, right?
Yeah, so it's your blind spot, but then there can be gadgets to help you see what's in that blind spot.
Right. And the willingness to experience those new things. For example, if you're normally driving a gas car and you're really comfortable, and then you go buy an electric car, and you might be uncomfortable. The willingness to be uncomfortable is how you're going to learn a new thing, even though you might think, well, how's that work? And that's what makes it fun. But see, there's an attitude shift too. It's like, well, this will be interesting, or I don't want to do it. And so you have some people that just won't do it.
Well, I just refuse to be defeated by it. I feel like sometimes it's making me stupid, and I'm out of my comfort zone, and I'm trying to figure this out. But yeah, I just worry that I'm going to lose some skill because I'm depending on, my car's cameras to help me park or do whatever.
And that's a really valid thing. In my car, I've got all these sensors, and they go off all the time when I park because it's a tight garage. But then somehow the trunk opened, wasn't supposed to, and there's a water bottle that hit the button accidentally because I had already shut the trunk. All the sensors are going off, and I'm ignoring them because that's what I do now. When in fact, I should have paid attention that one time out of 1,000. But the sensors and the way they built it is pretty stupid in my view. It doesn't help me do what I need to do. And that's where, obviously in the future, there'll be improvements on that because I don't know how many people park in a tight space. But in my case, that's what I do. So ignoring the sensors, that 1 in 1,000 times I bent the back hatch, which I got to fix. But at the same time, it's because I've ignored the sensors because they're always going off, and they're just nowhere near where they need to be. So it works both ways.
Okay, so when you talk about functional fixedness, how does that affect your ability to innovate and create something different?
So recognizing that we all have our biases creates the space where you're open to looking at something different, even if you don't see it. And one way to help defeat that is to get fresh eyes. So collaboration and improvisation is always helpful, but bringing in, I always find this kind of interesting. So every summer we do interns, and they're undergraduate and graduate level, and as I get older, they look quite a bit younger. They're all really bright kids. But I tell the guys here, because everybody here is busy, but I said, one of the things, these are paid internships, and we have an entire curriculum, but I said one of the things that we get from them is to see the world through their eyes. Because we're so, without even realizing it, it's easy to get locked into seeing the things a certain way. With these kids, these young people, they have a whole different life experience. A lot of them are pretty green, but yet it's interesting to spend time with them to see the world the way they see the world, because sometimes we overlook things. And I tell them we gain from that because just being around some of these kids, and we're mentoring them on things, but I like to listen to them because I'm curious how they see things versus how I see things. And at the end of the summer, we do a innovation presentations, and it's what can you do to make the world better? Anything you want. They pick an idea. They do 5 minutes and 5 slides. It's really interesting because it's what they think. It's not always what I think, but I always feel that I learned something because I'm overlooking something because I'm just taking it for granted. And so that's one way that I try to accommodate that problem, because we all are at risk of that. And sometimes what we do as well is and this is where it's an interesting thing. So from a pure business standpoint, you might not buy a piece of equipment unless you absolutely need it. And generally that makes sense. But what we've learned is sometimes we buy a piece of equipment and we make it a point just to play with it. And so way early on, before pretty much anybody knew much about a 3D printer, we just bought one. We weren't even sure how to use it. And I would say within, 30 days, some of the younger folks started hacking it and then building stuff. I mean, they made these wood resin boats, canoes. I mean, it sounds silly, but they're making new materials that looks like toothpaste and wood chips ground up, and we're printing it into what is a canoe, looks just like a canoe. And that may seem silly, but see, we're all learning, because we learn, one is we can make up our own materials, that you don't have to buy it, you can buy, but you can also just make it up. And second is making something and looking at the intricacies of that thing give you this insight that says, wow, I can make things I could never otherwise make. So back to this question of space armor. Now we can make it out of metal, and we can do, these very nanotechnology, lots and lots of really amazing things. But I can trace it back to, we don't have any real justification, but let's buy one of these puppies and see what happens. We still do that today. And if you ask the accounting department and the financial guys, they'll say, well, that's a waste of money. But what it does is it creates insights that you would otherwise never see, because you think things are only made one way. Here you're making something, you could argue, well, this wooden canoe, maybe it's a stupid thing, but in fact, we all learned a lot. And because of that, everybody grew. And that got others to think. And then you got others with huge knowledge and experience building on that, and other people building on that, and it just cycles like that.
Well, I have a half-built canoe on the bottom floor of my house, so I can appreciate that story. But, because, I've seen it being built, right? And then you come up with something different with a 3D printer, so, yeah.
Yeah, but that's just one example, because we imagine there's only one way to do something, when in fact there's many more ways to do it.
I think I was fortunate because in my family, we were always taught to be resourceful. So one thing that comes into the house can be used for something else, you know?
Absolutely. And see, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of all innovation. So if you've only got a few things to use, it's normal for a lot of people to fashion a new tool to get the job done. I've done that a bunch myself. As opposed to you can only use a particular tool. Now, sometimes one tool might be way more efficient. But if it's something that's really different, you may just have to kind of MacGyver the tool.
Yeah.
But see, that's a way to innovate, to use something in a way it wasn't intended, but to create something totally new. But see, some people are reluctant to try that for fear of looking stupid or failing, when in fact, you know, if you're going to try something, like when I was 16, I bought a car, and then I got a driver's license. And then I did the brake job, and first time I did a brake job, and I didn't do a good job. So at like 2 a.m, the brakes gave out on the freeway. This was in Denver. So I pulled into a mall. It was super cold. And I had to, with a pliers and a coat hanger, rebuild the brakes so I could get home. Because I hadn't put on some springs and parts properly, so it wasn't quite working. So I didn't have any braking. So I figured out how to make it work just good enough to get me back to the house. But it was literally pliers and coat hanger. And turns out you can use a coat hanger for a lot of things. But willingness to do that, right? And so part of the risk we have for people getting really great educations is sometimes they don't have those opportunities because they come from families that make sure everything is set up properly and it's all working just right and everything is there, as opposed to go figure it out.
Right. And you have to have that freedom to fail.
Right.
And you learn from that.
Right.
Yeah.
So nobody wants the brakes to go out on their kid's car. But I was insistent on doing my own brakes because I figured I needed to do it and I thought I could just get it done. And I learned that I wasn't that good at it, but I did it anyway. You know, but I learned a lot in the process. And in the meantime, you develop a sense of confidence of being able to kind of MacGyver something together to make something else work. So we do some of that here at Oceanit. And it encourages innovation. I mean, we're buying gear as well, but we're trying to do things that things aren't necessarily built for. And we just bought it's a synthesis machine for organonucleotide molecules that we're designing, and we literally just bought the machine. It's in the basement, and the first thing the guys did was they hacked it and it invalidated the warranty. And then we loaded up new software. We added all this stuff it's not built for because we're trying to create a whole new capability that doesn't exist at the risk of breaking a machine and, of course, losing the warranty. But we thought that might be the fastest way to get this thing done. So there's risk involved, but the willingness to try something like that, because you don't, obviously, if it's just purely from a business standpoint, you want to keep your warranty and everything else in place. But from an innovation standpoint, you may have to just swallow hard and just say, now let's just do it, see what happens.
So I imagine that when you have this team that you've assembled, and if you're coming from a different discipline, that you might have these blind spots because you're used to doing things a certain way. But if you have different cooks in the kitchen,
exactly,
you know,
exactly, we
experiment.
We've worked on trying to find the combination to we call high performance teams, people with totally different dispositions and backgrounds working together. But the high performance thing comes when they it's kind of like they learn how to jam together or play jazz or improvise, and they bring different ideas to the problem, and then they come up with answers. So we've experimented with that over the years and with some really good results. But it's an interesting point because, see, it's the differences that make it great. It's not the sameness. And so it goes to this argument of what creates innovation is diversity. And so when you've got, people have talked to me, and Singapore is a fantastic place, but they're trying to innovate, with all the same people, the same backgrounds. They're all very similar, as opposed to bringing people from totally outside sources that may not understand the culture, they may not fit in, they may not look like them. And people want to hire people like themselves. And what we try to do is have people consider hiring somebody that doesn't look like anybody they know, because they're bringing these different insights to things. But we have to make a deliberate point to do that, because human nature, such as it is, tends to, I tell people here, when we interview people, I said, don't try to find somebody just like you. Try to find somebody that's different. And we do. And it's interesting how that works, because it's almost like we're fighting gravity. People naturally want to do it the way they're comfortable, right? But we find when we get these different complementary skill sets and perspectives together, it's much more powerful.
What's another example of where you've been able to innovate around somebody's blind spot? Can you think of something that folks have developed?
Boy, there's so many of them. But for example, you see this rapid test. We'd never done one before.
The COVID test.
Yeah,
yes.
The COVID test. We had developed a tool to design a molecule. So that's what we had worked on with DARPA. But to put the team together that actually got this to market, it was totally untraditional. We did have people with degrees in virology, chemistry, nanotechnology, but we had physics, aerospace, computer science, all together. So the person who ran the clinical study was a PhD in aerospace engineering who had worked in semiconductors, but she ran the whole clinical study. The people that helped to create the technology came from, we were working in nanotechnology, and we mashed that up with this tool we developed at DARPA, the grammar of RNA, and then we added to that a virologist, because we thought, we weren't doing anything much in that area, but it was an odd group of people. But there's like 25 people that worked together, and they all brought different things to the table. It was not the traditional, I've done 50 medical devices, I'll do another medical device. It wasn't that at all. It was, no, we're just going to do this. And that's what made it so powerful. We did things that people thought you couldn't do. And that's what made it fun and obviously memorable. But it's really a good example of that. Because I told the team too, I said, the things you learned, we're going to be building more medical technology, some therapeutics and other things. Those skills that you learned, we're going to put to work.
Well, I just thought it was interesting during the pandemic, just because you had so many minds, so many think tanks working on a solution, and it sounds like everybody came to the solution just in different ways at different times.
Right. So it's a good example too. The mRNA vaccine was not common at all. It was a research project. I think DARPA originally funded it. It was considered controversial. They had some pieces they had to kind of figure out. Work had gone into it for a while, but one could argue it was not ready for prime time. But because of the pressure of the pandemic, and traditional vaccine development would have taken way longer. So a lot more people would die. So the calculus was, okay, if we do this, it might work and it might not. If we don't do it, it ain't going to work, and we'll eventually get something, but those vaccines actually aren't that good anyway. So turned out we were lucky as a country. But I have to credit groups like DARPA that took a chance on an idea that I'm sure was obscure at the time. And NIH, I don't think would touch it because it was too out there. But it was just a different idea, right? And the pandemic showed that you can bring technology to a field that people thought was settled and done, disrupt the whole thing, and now that same tool set you can use for all kinds of other things. There's a bunch of interesting work going on very specific therapies for different kinds of tumors, for example. Delivery systems were not thinkable like that. Now they are. You can design it and build it. We're rolling into the same thing. We may end up using some of those same tools because now the knowledge base has grown. So you can innovate on top of the innovation, on top of the innovation with all these cool ideas. That should push medicine. And I think that's what's actually going to happen. It's starting already. But before the pandemic, it was kind of settled. Uninteresting. It was limited capital. The capabilities for a lot of these things went overseas because there's more money in Viagra than there was in tests and vaccines, right? So the U.S. had very low capability in the country. But the technology and the science was going on here. And I think that's what restarted the conversations in medical technology for healthcare.
So it sounds like you do all this work, but you don't really throw things out. I mean, you put it off to the side, but that work isn't useless. I mean, it may not work for a certain problem that you have, but you can always go back, dust it off, and apply it to something else.
Exactly. So we're doing that now where we're exploring this category of materials we call unobtainium, so things that can't exist in the world. We demonstrated it with a project we did around a solid-state battery separator, which at the time there was no market for. But we showed that we could create these microshock waves using lasers to raster back and forth and produce materials with a printer that were not thinkable. And we call this category unobtainium. And now what we're doing is we're expanding that for integrating metals and other kinds of things that don't exist in the world that could be used for all kinds of applications. Space, some energy, and other things where we're limited by, well, there's steel and there's aluminum. Is there anything else? No, we can create these new exotic alloys that were not available in the world, but now we have these tools to make them. And what's happening, there's an appetite that's growing in the world between defense and energy in particular, and I think in healthcare, on materials that would solve problems that nobody imagined were solvable. And so we just started to really ramp up a bunch of that work because we can see a whole bunch of materials. And so this is an integration of new manufacturing, new ways to use materials, artificial intelligence, not the large language models as this noetic mathematical engine to optimize based on grammar, to come up with these new intricate patterns and materials that no one would be able to build, but we think we can build those. And so we're going to launch into that. We just started, and it's because of the early work we did with these battery separators, which was really cool, but the market wasn't ready. And that's not unusual for us. We are often 10 years ahead of everybody. So we may put it aside, and then with one other thing and another thing, we mash it up and make something new. It's like, okay, now that's really cool. And that may be going after a market that wants it right away. So we can then accelerate into that market.
Well, it'd be fun to see where you take the stuff you learn about butterflies here on Earth up in space.
Absolutely. And this is where things like dealing with carbon and climate, this is where it's going to happen. These different ways to use things where we might have been looking at it all along and just didn't see that it was in front of us. And my guess is that's the way it's going to work. Because, we get set in our ways, here's how the world is, and then we discover, well, maybe not really. How about this, right? Once that starts to go and build momentum, then who knows? So I'm an optimist. But I think that's how we do things like solve the climate problem. It's hard to say everybody stop using energy. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction. We're using more and more energy. So everybody's having fun with large language models, But the AI to run all those models uses more and more and more energy, not less. Energy use only goes one direction. So we've got to solve the energy problem. We've got to solve the climate problem. We've got to solve all those, and we've got to do them all. But I believe we will.
Do you have anything that reminds you to check your blind spot?
Well, there's a couple of techniques that I use. I mentioned the students, which is a good one. The other one that I've always found interesting is, my kids are grown up, but I've got grandkids. And I used to ask them to imagine certain things and how they could see it. And I always found that interesting because they're not encumbered by what they don't know. They don't know the difference between fantasy and reality. And sometimes the difference is just mature science. And so I think I can think of several examples that over the years, but one that was interesting when my son was small, he said, "Why can't cars look like chameleons? I want to make it red today and blue tomorrow." Like, what's wrong with that? And I said, "That's a very cool idea." Now, back then, 30 years ago, the technology wasn't ready, but today, yeah, maybe you can do something on demand. We're doing this really cool project now. It sounds science fiction, but it's a gel, and it's a sensor. You put it in your arm like a little dot, and the sensor will light up based on the chemicals in your blood. And so you can pick up the signal with your iPhone. But the interaction of the light comes from what's going on in your blood, and it's a sensor, but it puts out an optical signal. And, you've got everything from things like that to quantum dots. So, yeah, we could be more like cars that could be chameleons. But see, it's a failure of imagination for grown-ups not to imagine things sometimes. Where little kids, when you give them that opportunity. So I'm looking forward to doing that with my grandkids.
Well, I just want to be able to park my car like I used to be able to park without worrying about it changing color.
Right. Yeah, but those things will be sorted out too, I think. Eventually you'll be able to hit park. It'll just pull up in the street and say, "Just park," and it'll just park itself like a valet.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, then I lose my skill to park.
That's true. That's true.
Oh, well.
No, but it's what makes it interesting and exciting, and then deciding what are the things we want to keep, right? What are the things we don't want to give up, but do it on purpose, not unconsciously. And I think that's where the conversations right now around AI need to go. Deciding what do humans want to keep doing, because a lot of the things that they do, they don't have to. But so, for example, it's interesting. We like using, as an example, we like using a car because it's convenient, it's easy, it's predictable, and I don't have to work up a sweat to get where I got to go. But then at the same time, we may elect to go running. So we elect to go running as an exercise. And I tell people, because when I go running, it's like 90% mental. I clear my head. So there's a real benefit to actually physically doing it, as opposed to saying, "Machine, just take it from there." So there's a place for all these things, and kind of sorting that out is going to be really important in the future. But I'm an optimist.
Okay.